A Roman emperor doubles his own bodyguards' pay to buy their loyalty. 3 weeks later, they cut his throat and auction his throne to the highest bidder in the camp. A Byzantine emperor hands his rescuer the crown and the regalia, just for safekeeping, he says. 3 weeks after that, the rescuer is wearing them. A sultan takes the one general his own court warned him about and gives him an army. 31 times, a ruler stood next to the most dangerous man in the palace and decided the safest move was to make him more powerful. These are not jokes. Every single one of these actually happened, and every one is on the record. Power does not cancel stupidity. It just gives stupidity better weapons. Number 1. 1. In 284 AD, the Roman army was marching home through Mesopotamia when someone noticed the emperor's litter had been closed for days, and the smell coming out of it was getting hard to explain. Numerian was dead, and had been for some time. The man running the march, the man controlling access to that litter, was his own father-in-law and praetorian prefect, Arrius Aper. Aper had the job because Numerian trusted him more than any other officer in the army. That trust meant Aper could get close enough to poison or stab an emperor and simply keep the curtains shut until the smell forced the issue. When the truth came out, the army did not put Aper on trial. They dragged him in front of a young officer named Diocletian, who drew his sword and killed Aper on the spot, then let the soldiers proclaim him emperor. Numerian had built the ultimate loyalty test and handed it to the one-man positioned to fail it fatally. Diocletian would go on to reshape the entire Roman state. Numerian got a closed litter and a slow ride home. He wanted a shield. Instead, he got the man who buried him and then took his job. 2. Caracalla ruled by paranoia, and paranoia usually picks favorites. By 217 AD, the favorite was Macrinus, his praetorian prefect, a career bureaucrat who had never commanded troops in the field before Caracalla put him in charge of the emperor's own guard. Macrinus managed supplies, managed correspondence, managed the small details an emperor doesn't want to think about. Then a court astrologer sent a private letter predicting that Macrinus would become emperor. Caracalla's brother intercepted it. Instead of quietly investigating, the palace sat on the letter, and word reached Macrinus that his own execution was already being planned. He had nothing left to lose and every reason to move first. On a road near Carrhae, while Caracalla stepped aside to relieve himself, a soldier under Macrinus's orders stabbed him. Macrinus became the first Roman emperor who had never sat in the Senate, risen entirely from the paperwork job Caracalla had trusted him with. The empire had just watched a filing clerk take the throne because nobody canceled his access in time. 3. Elagabalus was 14 when the Praetorian Guard put him on the throne, and by 16 he had managed to alienate nearly every soldier in Rome with religious stunts and public humiliations of the men supposed to be protecting him. His solution was to promote his teenage cousin, Alexander Severus, to Caesar, hoping to look generous and secure at once. It backfired immediately. The guard adored the calm, well-mannered cousin and grew to despise the erratic emperor standing next to him. Elagabalus tried to have Alexander eliminated to remove the comparison. The guard found out. What could possibly go wrong? In March of 222 AD, the same soldiers Elagabalus had once bribed with enormous donatives dragged him and his mother out of a latrine in the camp, executed them both, and mutilated the bodies before dumping them in the Tiber. Alexander Severus, the cousin promoted to make the emperor look secure, was on the throne within hours. Elagabalus wanted a spare heir to make himself look stable. Instead, the spare became the replacement. 4. Philip the Arab inherited an empire under pressure on every border and needed someone he trusted completely to hold the Danube frontier while he managed Rome. He picked Decius, a respected senator with a strong military record and, crucially, No history of personal ambition that anyone had noticed. In 249 AD, Decius marched north to put down a mutiny among the border legions. The plan worked exactly backward. The mutinous troops, instead of standing down, declared Decius emperor themselves, and rather than refuse and risk being killed on the spot, Decius accepted and turned his newly loyal army south. Philip marched out to meet him near Verona with a hastily assembled force. He lost, and he died on the field. The man sent to restore order to the frontier had instead become the frontier's verdict on who deserved to rule. Philip wanted a fixer. Instead, he trained his own replacement and paid for the campaign that ended him. 5. Trebonianus Gallus made his first mistake in 251 AD by negotiating an embarrassing peace with the Goths that included an annual tribute, a deal that made him deeply unpopular with the army almost immediately. That was the first stupid thing. His second mistake was sending his most capable general, Aemilianus, to fight the same Goths along the Danube without settling the resentment at home first. Aemilianus won decisively and stopped paying the tribute Gallus had promised. His troops, thrilled with the victory and the savings, proclaimed him emperor on the spot. That was the second stupid thing, though by the time anyone counted it, it was already too late to matter. Gallus marched to confront him and was killed by his own soldiers near Inaramna before the two armies even fully engaged, murdered by men who preferred the general who'd stopped the payments. Aemilianus ruled for less than 4 months before the same pattern ate him too, but that particular irony belongs to a different item on this list. 6. By 456 AD, the Western Roman Empire ran on the goodwill of its barbarian generals more than on its own bureaucracy, and Emperor Avitus owed his throne almost entirely to one of them, the Swabian Visigothic commander Ricimer. Avitus assumed that gratitude built loyalty. Ricimer understood gratitude as leverage. Rome was starving that year, and Avitus made it worse by melting down bronze statues to pay his soldiers, a decision that turned the Senate and the public against him in a single season. Ricimer watched the approval collapse and moved. He defeated Avitus's forces at Piacenza, forced him to abdicate, and had him consecrated a bishop instead of executed, a mercy that was really just a way of making the removal look procedural. Ricimer would go on to make and break 3 more emperors over the next 16 years without ever taking the throne himself, ruling from behind a title he never bothered to claim. Avitus wanted a loyal sword. Instead, he trained the empire's first kingmaker. 7. 20 years and several puppet emperors later, Ricimer's model had become the entire operating system of the Western Empire, and by 476 AD, the man running it was a Germanic officer named Odoacer, commanding Foederati troops who technically served Rome but increasingly answered to no one but him. The reigning emperor was a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, installed by his own father as a figurehead, with no independent power and no army loyal to him personally. Odoacer's soldiers wanted land in Italy as payment for their service. Romulus's regime refused. That refusal was the last decision the Western Roman Empire ever made as an independent state. Odoacer's troops rebelled, killed the boy emperor's father, and Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus without bothering to install a replacement Roman emperor at all, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople instead. The Western Roman Empire did not fall to a foreign invasion. It fell because nobody in the palace had the land to pay the men holding the swords. Rome did not lose an empire. It stopped writing checks it could still cash. 8. Odoacer ruled Italy as king for 17 years, and in 493 AD, the Ostrogothic leader Theodoric arrived with an army and an offer. They would rule jointly, splitting power and territory, sealed with a formal banquet in Ravenna to celebrate the new arrangement. Odoacer, the man who had ended an empire by understanding leverage better than anyone else in it, apparently believed a peace banquet meant peace. At the feast, Theodoric personally killed Odoacer with his own sword, reportedly cutting him nearly in half, then had Odoacer's family and remaining supporters eliminated in the following days to close the loop completely. The man who taught Rome that power politics runs on force rather than titles had somehow forgotten his own lesson at the exact moment it mattered most. That sounds fake, even when it is completely real. Odoacer wanted a co-ruler to share the burden. Instead, he got a dinner invitation with no exit. 9. General Aetius spent decades as the indispensable man of the crumbling Western Empire, defeating Attila the Hun at the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD, and effectively running the government for Emperor Valentinian III, who by his 30s had never made a major decision without Aetius's approval. In 454, Valentinian finally decided he'd had enough of being managed and personally stabbed Aetius to death in the palace, believing he was finally reclaiming his own throne. A courtier reportedly told him afterward that he had just cut off his right hand with his left. He had. Aetius's personal guard, two soldiers named Optila and Thraustila, waited less than a year before assassinating Valentinian themselves in revenge, cutting down the last competent authority the Western Empire had left standing. Valentinian wanted to rule without a shadow standing over him. Instead, he removed the only man capable of holding the empire together and was dead within 12 months. 10. In 602 AD, Byzantine Emperor Maurice made the fiscal call that would define his legacy, ordering his army on the Danube frontier to winter north of the river to save money on supplies, rather than bringing the exhausted troops home. The soldiers mutinied. They needed a leader, and the man who stepped forward was a low-ranking centurion named Phocas, chosen less for brilliance than because he was willing to march on Constantinople when officers with more to lose weren't. Maurice had spent years trusting the army's professional structure to keep men like Phocas contained within it. The structure broke the moment the paycheck didn't arrive. Phocas entered the capital, was crowned emperor by the Senate under duress, and had Maurice and his 6 sons executed in front of him one by one before killing the emperor last. A centurion nobody in the palace could have named a year earlier became the man who ended a dynasty over a wintering allowance. 11. Byzantine Emperor Leo V spent years suspicious of his old comrade in arms Michael the Amorian, a fellow officer he had personally promoted through the ranks and eventually made commander of the palace guard. By 820 AD, Leo had enough evidence, real or invented, to have Michael arrested and sentenced to death, but delayed the execution until after the Christmas holidays, apparently confident a chained prisoner in the palace dungeon posed no immediate threat. That confidence was the entire plan, and it was not enough. Michael's allies, still holding palace positions Leo had never bothered to purge, disguised themselves as priests, entered the chapel during Christmas matins, and killed Leo at the altar. Michael was pulled from his cell, still wearing his chains, and crowned emperor before the shackles were even removed, ruling his first hours on the throne unable to fully close his hands. Leo wanted a controlled execution after the holidays. Instead, the holidays were the window his prisoners' friends needed. 12. Emperor Michael III found Basil, a Macedonian peasant with a reputation for extraordinary physical strength, working as a stable hand, and elevated him with startling speed. Chamberlain, then chief minister, then in 866 AD, co-emperor, an honor Michael handed him almost casually. The reasoning was personal loyalty and gratitude after Basil reportedly saved his life wrestling a bull at a public event. What Michael didn't account for was that co-emperor meant equal legal standing, and Basil now had every formal lever an emperor could use, without any of Michael's actual affection standing in the way. Basil grew convinced, correctly, that Michael intended to elevate a new favorite over him and strip his position. In September 867, Basil's men broke into Michael's bedroom and killed him while he slept off a night of drinking. Basil founded a dynasty that would rule Byzantium for nearly 2 centuries. Michael wanted a devoted bodyguard he'd plucked from nothing. Instead, he handed a stable hand the paperwork to inherit the empire. 13. Nikephoros II Phocas took the throne as a celebrated general and married the widowed Empress Theophano to secure it. But by 969 AD, his austere religious policies and heavy taxation had made him deeply unpopular, even as his own nephew and fellow general, John Tzimiskes, remained one of the few men he still trusted near the palace. Theophano, unhappy in the marriage, began an affair with Tzimiskes and helped smuggle him and a group of assassins into the palace on a freezing December night, reportedly lowering them in a basket through a window. Nikephoros hadn't thought to guard because Tzimiskes still held imperial trust and free access. They found the emperor asleep on the floor, having given up his own bed as an act of religious humility. Tzimiskes woke him personally before the killing, wanting Nikephoros to know exactly who had ended him. He was crowned emperor before the body was cold. Nikephoros wanted a loyal nephew watching his back. Instead, his back was the one place left unguarded. 14. Justinian II ruled with a cruelty that alienated nearly everyone around him, and in 695 AD, a general named Leontios led a revolt, deposed him, and rather than execute him, chose a punishment meant to disqualify him from ever ruling again, slitting his nose so a mutilated emperor could never legally reclaim the throne. It didn't work. Justinian survived in exile for a decade, rebuilding alliances, while back in Constantinople, the mercy Leontios had shown came due. Leontios himself was overthrown just 3 years later by a naval commander named Tiberios III, and suffered exactly the fate he'd inflicted, his nose cut and his freedom taken. Tiberios ruled for 7 years before Justinian, the original mutilated emperor, returned with an army and reclaimed his throne in 705, executing both Leontios and Tiberios in a public spectacle. Every man in this particular chain believed mutilation was mercy. It was just a longer countdown. The empire spent a decade finding out that a disfigured rival is still a rival. 15. Empress Irene ruled the Byzantine Empire in her own right after blinding her son to keep the throne, a decision that should tell you most of what you need to know about her judgment regarding loyalty. She relied heavily on her finance minister, Nikephoros, a career bureaucrat who managed the treasury with obvious skill and, by 802 AD, obvious access to nearly every lever of state power that mattered. What could possibly go wrong? Irene had spent her reign eliminating relatives who might threaten her and had almost no family left to protect her when the moment came. Nikephoros organized a bloodless palace coup while she was away from the capital, had himself proclaimed emperor by the very officials she'd trusted him to manage, and exiled her to a monastery on Lesbos, where she died in poverty within a year. The empress who had removed every rival by force lost her throne to the one man whose job was to count her money. 16. Isaac II Angelos took the Byzantine throne in 1185 through his own palace coup, then spent a decade proving he'd learned nothing from how he got there, alternating between military failures and lavish spending that emptied the treasury. His brother Alexios stayed close throughout, family being the one category of relationship Isaac assumed was safe by definition. It was not. In 1195, while Isaac was on a hunting trip outside the capital, Alexios had him seized, blinded to prevent his return to the throne, and imprisoned, taking the crown for himself as Alexios III. The betrayal came not from a general or a minister, but from the brother Isaac had never once suspected, precisely because blood ties felt like the one loyalty test nobody could fake. Alexios III would go on to mismanage the empire badly enough to help trigger the catastrophic Fourth Crusade less than a decade later. Isaac trusted the one relationship he thought didn't need watching. It was the only one that mattered. 17. Andronikos I Komnenos seized the Byzantine throne in 1183 through a campaign of terror against the aristocracy, executing rivals so ruthlessly that even loyal officials began hiding their competence to avoid looking threatening. Isaac Angelos, a minor nobleman with no particular ambition on record, found himself facing arrest in 1185 on suspicion alone, the emperor's paranoia having widened its net until it caught nearly everyone with a title. Cornered, Isaac killed the arresting officer, fled to Hagia Sophia, and by accident of timing found the public mood already at a breaking point. A crowd gathered, and rather than dispersing, it crowned him emperor on the spot. Andronikos, who had spent 2 years eliminating every organized rival he could identify, was captured by a mob he'd never bothered to purge because it wasn't organized at all. He was tortured and executed in the street. The paranoid emperor who tried to eliminate every threat with a name got taken down by the one force with no name to check off a list. 18. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz led his army to a decisive victory over the Mongols at Ain Jalut, a battle widely credited to the tactical brilliance of his own general, Baybars, who commanded the vanguard and executed the ambush that broke the Mongol force. Qutuz had promised Baybars a specific province as a reward for the victory. On the march home, he changed his mind and withheld it, a decision that told every ambitious commander in his army exactly how far gratitude went with this sultan. Baybars organized a hunting party outside Cairo as cover, and during the trip, he and several fellow officers ambushed Qutuz and killed him, reportedly stabbing him personally. Baybars was declared sultan within days by the same army that had just watched him do it. Qutuz wanted to keep his best general hungry enough to stay useful. Instead, hunger was exactly what made Baybars dangerous. 19. The Ayyubid Sultan al-Salih built his personal power on an elite corps of Turkic slave soldiers, the Bahri Mamluks, training and arming them into the most effective fighting force in Egypt. That was the first questionable decision, though it took his son to turn it fatal. When al-Salih died in 1249 during a Crusader invasion, his son Turan Shah inherited both the throne and the Mamluk corps his father had built, and immediately treated them as an inconvenience rather than an asset, favoring his own entourage from Syria and publicly threatening to replace the Mamluk commanders his father had relied on. That was the second stupid thing, and it was the one that killed him. In 1250, the Mamluk leadership, including a young officer named Baybars, stormed Turan Shah's camp, wounded him, chased him to a tower, burned him out, and finished him on the riverbank as he tried to flee by boat. Turan Shah inherited an army built for loyalty. He spent it learning who it was actually loyal to. 20. Sultana Razia ruled the Delhi Sultanate in her own right, starting in 1236, an unusually direct female claim to power that Turkic nobles in her court resented from the start. To secure military backing against them, she promoted and eventually married Malik Altunia, a provincial governor who had briefly rebelled against her, choosing to make her opponent her husband rather than continue fighting him. It looked like a masterstroke of political consolidation. It was actually a bet that marriage neutralizes ambition, and the bet failed within a year. In 1240, a coalition of nobles rose against them both, and Altunia's own loyalty, the thing Razia had married specifically to secure, proved conditional the moment the political winds shifted. Razia and Altunia were defeated in battle and killed while fleeing, reportedly by bandits, after the same nobles who'd once served her withdrew every remaining shred of support. Razia wanted to convert an enemy into a husband. Instead, she just gave an enemy a much closer position to fail her from. 21. The eunuch Bagoa served as Grand Vizier and chief power broker of the Achaemenid Persian court under Artaxerxes III, managing court politics so completely that by 338 BC he decided the king himself had become expendable and poisoned him along with most of his sons. Bagoas then installed a surviving young son as Arses, expecting a pliable puppet he could control from behind the throne he'd just cleared. Arses, understandably unnerved by watching his father and brothers die, began quietly planning to remove Bagoas the moment he had enough support. Bagoas found out first and poisoned him too, in 336 BC, then placed a cousin named Darius III on the throne, a man he assumed would owe him everything and question nothing. Darius did neither. Within the year, Darius discovered Bagoas was preparing to poison him as well, and forced the vizier to drink the poison himself before it could be used. Bagoas made 3 separate kings and was undone by the 4th. That is not a system. That is a losing streak with a title attached. 22. Xerxes I ruled the largest empire the world had yet seen, and by 465 BC had come to rely almost entirely on Artabanus, the commander of his royal bodyguard, for both physical protection and quiet political counsel, an arrangement that put the empire's most intimate access in the hands of one man with no formal check on his ambition. Artabanus, according to the ancient sources, had grown convinced he could seize power himself if the opportunity came, and the opportunity was structural. He was the man positioned closest to the king at every hour of every day. He assassinated Xerxes in his own bedroom, then attempted to pin the murder on the king's son to clear his own path to the throne. The plot unraveled within months when the surviving son, Artaxerxes I, uncovered the deception and had Artabanus executed. Xerxes had built an empire that stretched from India to Greece and still died because the one job he never questioned was the man standing closest to his bed. 23. Nader Shah conquered an empire stretching from Persia to Delhi through sheer battlefield brilliance, but by the 1740s had descended into paranoid brutality, blinding his own son on suspicion of disloyalty and taxing his exhausted territories into open revolt. His personal guard, largely composed of Afghan and Qizilbash officers he had promoted for their combat record rather than any particular closeness to him, watched the cruelty escalate with growing alarm, correctly reading the pattern as one that eventually pointed at them. In June 1747, several of his own commanders, including his nephew Ali Koli Khan, entered his tent at night and assassinated him in his sleep before he could act on rumors that he intended to purge his officer corps entirely. The empire he had built through conquest fractured within a decade, unable to survive the loss of the one man holding it together by force. Nader Shah trusted brutality to keep his own guard obedient. It only taught them how the job was done. 24. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim built an elite Turkish slave soldier corps in the 9th century to counterbalance the unruly Arab and Persian factions already crowding his court, a decision that solved one problem by creating a much larger 1-2 generations later. That was the first mistake, and it belonged to a caliph who never lived to see the consequences. By 861 AD, his grandson, Caliph al-Mutawakkil, faced a Turkish military establishment so entrenched in Samarra that it effectively ran the empire's finances and appointments regardless of what the caliph himself wanted. That was the second mistake, and it was the one that got him killed. Al-Mutawakkil tried to sideline the Turkish commanders in favor of a different son as heir, a move that threatened both the guard's influence and his own heir apparent's inheritance at once. His son, Al-Muntasir, working with the Turkish officers his great-grandfather had first recruited, had him assassinated at a banquet that same year. Historians call the decade that followed the anarchy at Samarra 4 caliphs deposed or executed in 9 years by the same guard corps built to protect them. 25. Ottoman Sultan Osman II inherited a court dominated by the Janissary Corps, an elite military institution that had grown so powerful it functioned as a check on the Sultan rather than a servant of him. And in 1622 he decided the fix was simple: disband them, and replace them with a new army loyal directly to himself, recruited from Anatolia and the Levant. He announced the plan poorly, framing it as a religious pilgrimage to Mecca to disguise his real intention of raising troops abroad, and the Janissaries figured out the plan almost immediately. Rather than wait to be dissolved, they revolted, stormed the palace, and seized Osman personally. He was imprisoned in the same fortress that had once held political rivals and, within days, strangled on the orders of the very corps he had tried to eliminate. He became the first Ottoman sultan ever deposed and executed by his own soldiers, a distinction that told every sultan after him exactly how far reform could go before it got you killed. 26. Sultan Selim III spent years building the Nizami Seded, a modernized military force trained along European lines, intended specifically to reduce the Ottoman Empire's dependence on the increasingly unmanageable Janissary corps. The reasoning was sound. The execution created a rival armed institution inside the same city as the men it was meant to replace, and gave the Janissaries every reason to move before the new force could fully mature. In 1807, a Janissary-backed uprising led by a junior officer named Kabakshu Mustafa erupted in Constantinople, and rather than defend his reforms with the very troops he'd built to protect them, Selim ordered the Nizami Seded disbanded to appease the mob, hoping submission would save his life. It didn't. He was deposed within days and his cousin installed in his place. Selim was murdered the following year during a failed counter-coup attempting to restore him. He built an army to save his throne and dismantled it himself in the exact moment it might have. 27. Sultan Abdulhamid II ruled the Ottoman Empire through an extensive surveillance state for over 3 decades, yet somehow allowed a reformist officer movement calling itself the Committee of Union and Progress to gain real strength inside his own military academies and garrisons, dismissing the young officers as idealistic and therefore harmless. That assumption aged badly. In July 1908, the committee's officers forced him to restore the constitution he had suspended years earlier, and when he attempted a counter-coup the following spring using loyalist troops, the committee's forces crushed it within weeks. In April 1909, they formally deposed him and installed his more pliable brother in his place. Abdul Hamid, famous for reading every telegram and monitoring every rival personally, had spent his surveillance apparatus watching everyone except the junior officers he considered too insignificant to bother tracking. The most watched sultan in Ottoman history missed the coup because he was looking in the wrong direction the entire time. 28. By the middle of the 7th century, the Merovingian kings of the Franks had become so ceremonially weak that historians simply call them the do-nothing kings, real governance having shifted entirely to an office called Mayor of the Palace, a position the royal family kept filling with the most capable administrator available because someone had to actually run the kingdom. For generations, that arrangement held because the mayors had no legal path to the throne itself. Then, Pepin the Short, having inherited the office from his father and grandfather before him, decided the arrangement was overdue for an update. In 751 AD, he sent envoys to Pope Zachary with a simple question dressed as theology. Should the man who actually holds power also hold the title? The Pope agreed. Pepin deposed the reigning king, Childeric III, had him tonsured and sent to a monastery, and was anointed king himself. 3 generations of Merovingian kings had outsourced the entire job of ruling to one family. Eventually, that family stopped seeing the point of the outsourcing. 29. Tang Emperor Xuanzong presided over one of China's great cultural golden ages, and in his later years grew infatuated with his consort Yang Guifei, whose favor extended to her adopted son, a border general of Sogdian Turkic descent named An Lushan. Xuanzong gave An Lushan command of three of the empire's most powerful frontier armies simultaneously, an unprecedented concentration of military authority that several court officials warned against directly and were ignored. An Lushan, watching political rivals at court maneuver to have him recalled and possibly executed, decided the safer bet was to move first with the forces already under his command. In December 755, he marched on the Tang capital at the head of an army the emperor himself had built for him, declaring a new dynasty. The rebellion that followed lasted 8 years and, by some estimates, cost more lives than any conflict in history before the 20th century. Xuanzong wanted a border guardian loyal to his favorite consort. Instead, he handed the empire's own armies to the man who would nearly end it. 30. Oda Nobunaga had unified more of Japan by 1582 than any warlord in over a century, and trusted one of his most capable generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, enough to send him ahead with a substantial force to reinforce a campaign against a rival clan, while Nobunaga himself rested at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with only a small personal guard. Mitsuhide had reportedly been humiliated by Nobunaga in front of other retainers on more than one occasion, and whatever loyalty remained had worn thin enough that an open route to the temple looked less like an assignment and more like an opportunity. Instead of marching to reinforce the campaign, Mitsuhide turned his army and surrounded the temple at dawn. Nobunaga, realizing the position was hopeless against a force he had personally equipped, set the temple on fire and died by his own hand rather than be captured. Mitsuhide's own reign lasted 13 days before he was defeated and killed by another of Nobunaga's generals. Nobunaga built the army that ended him and lent it out for one afternoon too many. 31. Pharaoh Ramesses III ruled Egypt through one of the last stable stretches of the New Kingdom, and like most pharaohs kept an extensive royal harem, including a secondary wife named Tie, who wanted her own son, rather than the designated heir, on the throne after him. She recruited conspirators from deep inside the palace itself, harem officials, a steward, even physicians with direct access to the pharaoh's person, people whose entire job depended on proximity and trust. The plot, documented on what modern historians call the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, involved wax figures for magical harm alongside a more direct physical attack, and forensic analysis of Ramesses's mummy in 2012 confirmed a deep throat wound consistent with the ancient trial records. The conspiracy was ultimately uncovered and dozens of participants executed, but Ramesses did not survive to see the trial himself. He died from the wound before the plotters were even caught. The pharaoh, who ruled from a position no mortal was supposed to threaten, was undone by the household staff standing closest to him every single day. 31 rulers. 31 men who looked at the most dangerous person available and decided the safest move was proximity. A raise, a marriage, a crown handed over for safekeeping. Every one of them believed loyalty could be manufactured the same way you manufacture an army or a treasury, something you build once and then stop worrying about. History disagreed, over and over, on 3 different continents and across 2,000 years. So which one on this list got you the angriest, or which one made you laugh out loud at how avoidable it was? Put it in the comments. And if you want the next set of rulers who built their own downfall by hand, subscribe, because every single decision on this list had someone standing behind it, nodding along right up until the end.